Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the delayed beginning. But yeah, we're happy to have you here. We have people in our audience that those of you online might have already seen, and we have a number of people online as well. This session today of Local Talks is called Architectural Education, Nurturing East Africa's Architects of the Future. As I guess the Local Talks team, we've been thinking about speaking on architectural education for a while, so we're happy this is finally coming together. Today we have 3 speakers with us. They're all online. We have Dr. Hermy Delport, Dr. Mark Olweny, and Mr. Garett Gantner. We're also pleased to have 3 panelists that will join us in the discussion. And these are Dr. Connie and Nshemereirwe, architect Davy Mugamba, and Stephen Muwanguzi. I will introduce all of them a little bit better before they before they speak. After the order of the events are that we'll have 3 presentations from the 3 different speakers. And then after those presentations, we will have a question and answer session, and that will begin with the panelists. And then following that, we'll open the floor to people who are here with us, and then also those who are online. I think that's kind of a very short introduction. I hope many of you already know what Local Talks is. I forgot to say that. It's essentially a series of events that we hold 4 times a year, all based on green design. And we've tried to touch a number of different topics over the years. Yeah, and welcome again. So I think Dr. Hermy will speak first. I will give a short introduction to who she is. So Hermy is a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics at Cape Town University. Her experience in architectural education started at the Cape Tectonic, later CPUT, where she was a senior lecturer and acting head of the department. Whilst there, she established the Design Build Research Studio with her colleague Rudolf Perold, through which she did several live and design and build projects. At CPUT, she led the review of existing and the development of new architectural and interior design curricula to align with a new national higher education structure. And this curriculum work saw her appointed at a private higher education institution called Stadio. And there she steered the design and development of programs for higher certificates of master's programs in architecture, interior design, and sustainable living for the School of Architecture and Spatial Design. So thank you for joining us, Hermy. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Randy. I am going to just start my presentation, and if you can tell me once you see it, just pressing the button. It should be there soon. While it is loading, it says it's working out a few details. It sounds very architectural, working out a few details. There it seems to have worked out its details now. Can you see? I don't hear anybody, but okay, there's a thumbs up. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. This is actually my first event that I join, and I hope that I will be joining more now that I've been invited, and I know of it. I will definitely be joining more, so I'm really looking forward to this. And thanks for the organization. The graphic that you see on screen is from a paper called Zombies in the Studio Towards Nurturing Pedagogical Approaches for Architectural Education in Sub-Saharan Africa. Mental health challenges faced by architecture students, and it deals with issues of equity, background, and access. And I did this paper with Mark Olweny, who is also going to speak later, and a number of other colleagues, 1 or 2 that I will mention as we go forward. But I'm not really speaking about the content of that at this talk, although I do think you will find it interesting. When Felix invited me, I was not very sure about how to approach this. And it made me reflect and think a lot about where we are at this point in time, 2024, where I find myself and where we can see ourselves going. So this is more reflection than a direction, and I just want to really share some ideas with you and some things that I've learned along the way and that I hope might contribute to your thinking about where we can go with architectural education in both East and the rest of Africa. So Randy gave a introduction about me, and I want to share a little bit more about my personal background, because I think histories and backgrounds matter a lot. We know that. And in preparing for this, I read an article by, again, Mark. Thanks, Mark, for writing that. The foreign and the local in architectural education in late colonial and post-independence East Africa. And that at least gave me a good background on the situation in East Africa, but I still know very little. So I know more about my own context, South Africa, but I think in many ways there are definitely overlaps. So I come from a family where my father was a minister, and we lived in the house of the church always. I know there's an English word for it, and I can only remember the Afrikaans word, which is pastorie. But I lived in a few unique houses, very much a Victorian old house with wide corridors at one point when I was very little. And then when we had to move, because as a minister you move where you are called, we lived for a while in a amazingly architecturally designed home, of which I can still draw the diagram now. My mother hated the house because she said it wasn't practical. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because it will give you a perspective on where I'm coming from and why I find both architecture and architecture education fascinating. And I'm always looking for ways on how we can improve and what we can do in terms of architecture education. So while I was growing up, I also had the privilege of my father that made things. He wasn't a great maker, but he always attempted to make things. So he rebuilt. We had one of those old Volkswagen bread combis that's like looks like a bread, those old bus combis. And he rebuilt the interior. And at one stage, he rebuilt like a whole divider in a room, which I shared with my sister so that we could each have our own little space. And helping him and being in those different buildings, quite fascinating buildings for me, I think shaped how I got into architecture. And I was in practice for a while, but found myself by accident almost at the Cape Technikon. And you heard about the work that I did there. But I worked there with Yolanda Morkel, and I'm not sure, I don't think she's here today, but we did a lot of work together in terms of looking at how students learn. And at the Cape Technikon, we both studied at the University of Port Elizabeth. And the Cape Technikon was more vocationally focused and more technically focused and had a more diverse body of students than where I studied. Students were also a bit more challenged in terms of their education and often struggled with to grasp concepts. So we had to invent systems and ideas to work with that. In 2011, we worked together on a part-time program for our second years, and we developed this idea of being online and on-site at the same time. So online, at that stage, we did crits on Skype because our students were not in the studio; they were away at home. And on site, we started looking at design build work, so trying to get those two opposites to work together. And then that work started to translate into the curriculum work I was doing at CPUT, where I had to look at, with a team, at reorganizing our diploma and at that stage the BTech, and looking at further qualifications. And then the absolute privilege to work at Stadio, where I could look at a series of architectural qualifications. But in all of this work, and through the research I've done with others and by myself as well, was always a search for the relevance of the education. What is relevant? How do we include as many people as we can? How can we adapt? How can we be flexible? So that's something always that came through in the work. So I want to take a pause to say where I think we are at the moment. What's the current state of affairs that we find ourselves in terms of architectural education? And you will see a quote there that dates back to 2020, and you're going to wonder why in 2024 I still refer to COVID. But if you look at that quote, it says that we are suddenly finding what was once impossible is now suddenly possible. And then the second part, big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. And I don't know if you are aware, or maybe some of you were part of research that were being done and discussions that were had during that time, and that sudden shift from being in the studio to being online, and people adapting very quickly. But at the moment, I'm finding that certainly in South Africa, that most people have converted back to the pre-COVID state. It is as if what was learned and that rapid way of changing has not filtered through to what we are doing right now. So we are basically back to where we were before COVID, and not really looking at the lessons that were so easy to, not easy, but relatively easily, speaking in terms of the circumstances, to implement during that crisis. So my question is, why are we now reverting back? Then we are also in a place, that a world that is moving rapidly forward in terms of technology. AI is opening possibilities. AI is opening possibilities for our students, for ways of working, and I don't think we are embracing that yet. In terms of our formal educational spaces, we are very much tied to structures of universities and to accrediting bodies, so it doesn't leave us much leeway to necessarily change things. And then we are also referred to before to our unique context, being in South Africa, East Africa, Africa itself. And I want to tell you two quick stories of just how this came home to me, in contrast with a space like, if we look at a space like Australia. We were working on a collaborative project with a university in Australia, and the students presented, the Australian students presented solutions for an urban space that dealt with safety. And we couldn't understand their reasoning until we realized the safety they were talking about was only in terms of traffic and cars. And that was the only safety concern that they could think of. They had no other ideas around safety like we would have in South Africa, different ways of thinking about safety. It was a very practical traffic solution, and that just drove home the point that we are really in different contexts and in a unique context. So my question for myself when I looked at what I wanted to tell you was, what are the non-negotiables that I think we really need if we want to create educational spaces in our own context that can work? And that might be additional and optional, not in our formal spaces necessarily, that our formal spaces cannot necessarily accommodate. And to me, that is accessibility or radical accessibility, flexibility, and making use of experiences or experiential learning. Accessibility for people from different backgrounds, from different contexts, that just widening accessibility, then flexibility, being able to access education at different points, being able to be flexible in terms of the way that students address projects and get into their projects, that it's not necessarily a set curriculum, that they are able to come in and out of education if they need to, if they have financial stability, instability, that they are able to work. So being flexible for the various needs that we find in our own context. And then also the other one that I think is a non-negotiable is that absolute idea of hands-on experiences, the idea of making, not just making in terms of understanding how things are put together, but also experiences in terms of visiting actual buildings, visiting actual practices, not being stuck in the studio, but being able to experience real life spaces, real life communities, real life problems that we need to find solutions for. I looked at a few inspirational spaces and inspirational ideas that are already out there, and then I will also share, the slides are not showing. And now, sorry, which slide? Are you still seeing the first slide only? Garret, Gantner. It's now, okay. Okay, let me just go back. Okay. So I'm thinking about inspirational ideas that are already out there. I don't know if you know of the Master in Public Interest Design that has been developed by Karen Conbrink for the University of Pretoria. And then I've put some information there of Make Your Own Masters. It's a series at Tabasco Architecture is running a series on architectural education. And they had Stacey Woolsey recently speaking about a way that you can actually put together your own masters from experiences. So you don't follow a set curriculum, but you build your own masters from small bits. And then they had another speaker, Mark Naveau, that looked at scaling up class sizes. We are used to quite small staff to teacher, staff to student ratios, 1 to 15 often. They work with a ratio of 1 to 100, and they've developed systems that can actually work with that. So they are really broadening access to education. And it's really important, I think, that we start looking at these examples and seeing how we can implement them. So what are the possibilities for the future? I'm leaning towards something called educational informality, where we complement the formal institutions, but where we can move away from, or have students that can move away from formal institutions if they cannot afford it, if they cannot access that, where they're able to access open resources and find collections of information of various knowledges that they can then build their own, let's call it, program or qualifications with, so that they can build their own education. If we then also have open practices, or practices with an S, both in terms of professional practice and what we do in that practice, and students that are interested in education can access that, can work alongside almost like an apprenticeship. So being able to access open information online and being able to, in a hands-on way, participate in actual practice in a professional space. And if we could form ecosystems and networks to allow people that want to study architecture, but that cannot necessarily access formal education, to provide them with spaces and networks where they can see these different options. Where do I find open resources? Which practices will allow me into their space and teach me with them? And then if we could find a way that these little learning blocks can be stacked and recognized to form a full qualification without necessarily going through a formal education. I think we are at a point where formal education alone cannot address the needs that we have. We have to, in some way, embrace informality in education and create a space where we can put things together in a way that can be flexible and that can provide many alternative options for our different backgrounds and our different contexts. I want to end with a quote, and I'm not going to read the whole quote, but it comes from my thesis on design build. And I'm going to read a little bit. It says, in the not too distant future, I see an architectural student who has just graduated and is about to enter the architectural profession. The soon-to-be architect knows how to engage meaningfully with the community, how to collaboratively generate solutions, and how to manage a project from inception to completion, how to physically contribute to the making of the building, and how to sustainably implement technology, where to find funding, and how to set up an entrepreneurial business. And that the future of a country depends on her actions. And she continues with the idea of public architecture. But if we can imagine somebody that's interested in architecture and that might not be able to access formal education and the type of knowledges that they would require, and are able to send them in different directions to open access resources, to hands-on real experiences in different spaces in different countries that they can access, and they can then build through educational informality a package that they can put together as an experiential way of getting the architectural qualification. I think we will be able to open up a lot of space for those that cannot access our formal education systems. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah, so.
Thank you, Hermy, for your presentation. I'm sure there's already a few ideas that can be discussed. I think we'll hand over straight to Mark. So I'll ask if, we just switch over. And I'll give another short introduction. So thank you for joining us as well. Dr. Mark Olweny is currently a senior lecturer in architecture in the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the University of Lincoln in the UK. And he is an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Faculty of the Built Environment at Uganda Martyrs University in Uganda. Mark has more than 20 years of experience in the architectural education and practice in Australia, Canada, the Republic of Ireland, the UK, and Uganda. His research interests focus on environmental design, as well as rereading colonial and post-colonial architecture and urbanism in East Africa. He is also actively involved in research on epistemologies that underpin architectural education. I'll hand over straight to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides on the screen.
Yes, we can see them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to follow on from Hermy, which also means that there's some parts of this presentation I actually don't need to present because Hermy's already presented them, which is fine for me because I have a lot to get through. My presentation is titled Transgressions in Architectural Education in East Africa, which is actually the title of an upcoming publication that will be out in June or July this year. So I thought it would be quite appropriate to present it here. So in response to the call or the question set up by the organizers of this Localtalks symposium, I draw on work that I've undertaken over the last 5 years. Work that draws on my experiences as an educator, but actually began with my doctoral thesis back in, which I was completed in 2016 at the Cardiff University Welsh School of Architecture. The findings that came out of that were that the processes within architecture education, the processes that scaffold architecture education, largely in the English-speaking world, do set up sort of a framework that has persisted for almost, or well, just about a century now. Haven't really changed in that period, which is part of the reason we're having this discussion. And this was the paper that Hermy sort of alluded to in her presentation, which was funded by a Grant Foundation grant just in 2017, 2018. That paper led to a more provocative exploration of architecture education in East Africa, published in the landmark publication Architectural Pedagogies of the Global South. The chapter titled Questioning Conventions of Western Architecture Pedagogy in East Africa unpacked the conventions that have influenced and continue to influence architecture education across the region. The final paper in this series, well, I call it final, but I guess it should be the latest paper in this series, will be published in an upcoming publication, the Routledge Handbook of Architecture and Urban Space and Politics, Volume 2, which will be published, as I said, in June and July. The paper is this one titled Necessary Transgressions in Architecture Education in Uganda. Not sure it's changing. There we go. So before I continue, it's worth revisiting some of the issues of my research and the emphasis on the reproduction function of architecture education. This has been exacerbated by, in some way, the separation between the epistemology of architecture education, how we investigate the world, how we are taught to view the world, versus our ontological dimension, which is how we as individuals and societies view the world. And it's that separation that causes a lot of the challenges that we see and that were being discussed today. This naturally has had an impact on the nature of interactions within education, as it does for the values that are passed on. It becomes significant, as you note, by these two quotes by Foster from 1961 and Peter from 2002. Foster was the chaplain at Makerere University in the 1960s, or early 1950s, 1960s, and Odok Pedo was, or still is, a lecturer in fine art at the University of Nairobi. And it's very clear from their engagement in education, well, from Pedo's engagement in education, that your background essentially was negated. And Foster, who was a lecturer, also pointed to that the fact that we ignored students' backgrounds when they come into education. This naturally has a consequence in whatever happens going forward, by removing people's historical and cultural past as a precursor to acquiring educational capital. Something that, despite the many decades since independence, is still something that is a contention within schools of architecture and universities across the region. It does bring forth the idea of sameness, which in architecture education means socializing students into an idealized, in quotation marks, idealized profession that is often seen to be out of touch with the needs of the societies they supposedly serve, which we could also ascribe other words to it, indoctrination, ideological hegemony, and even cloning. Things that we shouldn't associate with a profession that is supposedly talking about creativity. Thinking about that, we start looking at some of the literature that's associated with this idea of sameness. And the two books that immediately come to mind for me are Todd Strasser's The Wave and Musa Okwonga's One of Them. Musa Okwonga is a Ugandan author, and he was writing quite recently. That book's from 2021. The Wave is much earlier, 1981. But what they suggest are the consequences of this indoctrination approach, this idea of sameness, and it's worth reading those to see what happens there. The Wave, I believe, was fiction, but there was an experiment that was actually tried on that. Musa Okwonga's is actually a real life story, and it's worth a read. So what does it mean for us? We're just faced with a scenario where the educational approach itself contributes to an inability to adequately engage with what I call an unknown future. And that's a future where, for the most part, we have no idea what's going on. But we spend a lot of time asking ourselves as architects, as designers, and students who are preparing for their future engagement in practice to deal with it in a way that has long gone, which is already problematic, as you can see. Part of the challenge of architecture education is you're doing two things simultaneously. You're learning how to be an architect, but you're also learning how to do architecture. And those come in direct conflict within architecture education, because learning how to be entails trying to replicate or copy somebody else. And now that, as you can see, automatically becomes a problem when the things you're trying to deal with don't really exist yet. So how do you start engaging students in this discussion and building in the capability to address this unknown future? So the idea of values, as you see, continues through that. And we got these two quotes, which are quite important for us. And I will read both of them because they sort of come to the gist of what we're trying to say and what I'm trying to say here. I'll read Bernard Shumi's first. Most architects work from paradigms acquired through education and subsequent exposure to architectural literature, often without knowing what characteristics have given these paradigms the status of rules. We will come back to that particular one because I address it in a little bit more detail going forward. And then the Fraud and Harris one is from 2015. It's actually related to a conversation they were having with a colleague of theirs. And he stated, whether we breed it or whether it's always been there, there's a generalized arrogance amongst architects that they know best. Maybe it's true of all professions, but it's particularly true of architecture. Now, you put that in architecture education and you see the consequences of this. So if you get the arrogance starting off in the school and then it continues building up, the consequential output of that can be quite dangerous. Thomas Dutton, the late Thomas Dutton, described this as the uninformed consent to the dominant culture. The dominant culture in this case being the perceived place of architects and where they actually perceive themselves to be doing something which they're actually not really a part of. So what emerges through this is an education that essentially is devoid of values or the values that we think it should have. Despite architecture education being, or the essence of education and architecture education in particular, its key essence is about building value systems in students. Now, if it's doing that, but the outcomes are going in a different directions, there is obviously something not working very well. So what exactly needs to be rethought now becomes a question. The first thing I have to point out is the content of our curriculum. These are the course content of two architectural history courses that exist somewhere on the continent. But as you can see very clearly, they have absolutely nothing to do with the context within which they're being taught. And this comes back to what Hermy talked about, this idea about experience. Now, if your experiences have been negated from the get-go, what chance have you got to actually engage in the very things that you're being asked to do? So if the sum total of architectural history is the architectural history of Europe, what is going to happen to somebody who is being asked to engage with the conditions of the majority in the context of a developing or developmental society is probably the best way I can put that. Now, this goes beyond history itself. You have a lot of courses that have obsolete content within that. For instance, the teaching of MS-DOS in an introduction course to computing. Why are we still teaching MS-DOS, which is a program that most people have never even heard of, but it still exists in a number of courses? Why are we not teaching computer-aided architectural design? And I'm very deliberately calling it CAAD rather than CAD. Why aren't we teaching building information modeling? Why aren't we teaching, why aren't we teaching integrated design computing? So the same arguments can be spread right across other elements of the curriculum. This is a challenge when you have a static curriculum which hasn't actually addressed the very thing that it's trying to do. Challenge of also treating history in a way that it's static. The fact that a history of architecture in Africa is reduced to form and material means that the outputs inevitably suggest that architecture of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa are circular buildings, which completely ignores the fact that circular buildings are actually a technological solution to a particular set of conditions. Also negates the fact that in the majority of the African continent, circular buildings actually are not the traditional way of building. But you will not believe how often this shows up as being African, is it? It also suggests that what is African is static and hasn't moved beyond a particular point in time. Is that what we're suggesting? And if that is true, maybe the entire discussion about architecture education goes away, because then we don't need it at all, because we already have the answers. So why are we discussing it anyway? So the stereotypical view that is perpetuated by a lack of engagement with examples from across Africa and the notion that architecture is static and never changing seems to be also part of this problem. This also sees architecture as being form-making rather than a response to some key ideas. Responding to users, the people use a place, responding to site and environment, responding to place, and responding to materials and construction techniques, the stuff that buildings are built of. So this does fail to appreciate the reality that we have moved on a long time, and what we're dealing with from the past should be looked at in the context within which was built, and not as a continuum and the idea that we need to go back to an idealist past which actually didn't really exist. Now, understanding vernacular is an important part of architecture education, and we have to embrace that. This publication, which was came out in 1997, edited by Paul Oliver, and it's still a definitive guide to vernacular architecture across the world. I think it's about 10 volumes. It's a big, massive book. Unfortunately, it doesn't even exist in pretty much all architecture schools in the region. So how are we going to engage with something when we even have no documentation of what is? So sadly, most of this information doesn't make it into curricula. It doesn't get published. It doesn't get engaged with. It is that other that is left to die because we don't care about it. So how are we going to address the challenges of today when we don't even know where we've come from? So when we start looking at this, we start seeing the blind spots within architecture education, and it's our job to start addressing those blind spots. Now, I do present this as an interesting example. It's Nshemereirwe Cultural Center in Numia by Renzo Piano. Now, I am going to critique my own use of Renzo piano in this particular case, because I am using a star architect in this presentation. You'll forgive me for that, but I'm using it here for a very particular reason. One of the things that we have to be aware of also when we're teaching architecture is who exactly we teach. And I challenge you, anybody in the room, anybody online, how many African architects do you know beyond David Ajayi and Francis Kerry? The answer will surprise you, not very many. This is part of our challenge. But the very fact that that exists is because we are not writing our own histories. We're not presenting those histories to other people. We are still insisting that somebody else do it for us. That is not how it works. Unless you do it, no one is going to do it for you. Getting back to the cultural center in Umea, the big issue with this particular project was how you take ideas from the vernacular and respond to it going forward. We don't replicate it. You don't build a hut. You don't build it that is thatched with and it's circular. Respond to the issues, the ideas. And when you look at the finalized building, you can see that it is not the typical hut. It's an interpretation of it. And that is only possible when we actually understand the why that building existed in the first place, how exactly it's responding to place, to climate, to the users. That is what we're responding to. If we insist on keep building the same thing over and over again, we're basically saying we don't have a job. So why are we doing that? Key question for us. Coming back to our context, architects work in the context of Uganda and Namibia in this case. So Nshemereirwe's Habitat Research and Development Center in Windhoek, Namibia, and the British High Commission by Coleman Nightingale and FBW Architects. Right? In this case, what I'm interested here is the engagement with materials and tectonics. Tectonics is the language of architecture. We build buildings using materials. The materials have particular properties. They have characteristics. They have a texture. They have a feel. They have a visual aspect to it. But how much of that is actually taught? Or we just assume that that is the role of the builder to do. And we forget the fact that that is the key thing that architecture solves. So engaging with that in architecture school also becomes important. What does it actually mean when we're starting to design and build buildings in our local context? The idea of the materials themselves become critical. So the Louis Kahn's adage, can you ask a brick what it wants to be, becomes critical. So if we compare some of these very fine-lined mortar joints and compare them to the typical mortar joints you see the difference. That's because there's attention to detail in one versus the other where it's taken for granted. Now, bringing this back to some of the things we do, looking at why there is no documentation of history across the region, which is no one's fault by our own, really. And what are we going to do about it? This toolwork for assessing heritage places was an interesting take on how this could potentially be done. Yes, granted, it came from the Getty Foundation, which is based in the US, but it did attempt to do that. And then putting these different buildings on there starts bringing out questions. What's the meaning behind them, beyond just looking at form and materials? There's a meaning behind these buildings. The social meaning becomes important, something that we can actually start engaging with to understand the theories behind architecture and how they actually came to be and what they mean to us going forward, which now suggests that research becomes a key part of what we should be doing. So these are two that were done by my students about 4 or 5 years ago, Joseph Matovu and Brenda Chirabo, looking at contemporary buildings in our context in East Africa, document them, giving us some reasoned or researched ideas of what the buildings mean and how they actually can be communicated to other people. And this is something anybody can do. This is something that architecture students can do. This is something that architecture educators can do. The basis of this is a book that was published about 5 years ago. The original was published 10 years ago on understanding contemporary buildings. The whole point of that book was to help students understand how to document buildings. So it becomes a useful tool to explore buildings that haven't been documented and what they actually can contribute to our understanding of the theories of architecture in our own context. Which brings me to a project that a colleague of mine, Tony Wako, and myself have been working on this year, which is trying to understand contemporary buildings in the context of Uganda. Again, this idea that we have a history, but it's very rapidly disappearing, and very soon we'll actually have nothing to tell the next generation of architects because we've allowed it to disappear. So the Energo project, Uganda International Conference Center and Nile Hotel, which is adjacent, has a very fascinating story. And when it eventually comes out, I hope everybody gets to read it. It's information that unfortunately is not in the public domain, and it requires a lot of effort to get to it. But some of the things are intriguing nevertheless. The relationship between Muwanguzi Hall in Lusaka, Zambia, built in 1970 as well. And then looking closely to see what was proposed versus what was built. This is an elevation, erroneously says east elevation, but it's actually the west elevation. Then you very quickly see that the project was actually never finished. What was proposed? What was built? Why certain aspects were there in the first place? And why were they never completed? That's the fascination of history that we miss because we do not consider our own history as part of architecture education. The last thing I'll be looking at, of course, is this idea of empathy. Hermy has hinted at it, and the diagram that she presented was part of this idea that empathy is a key part of what we do. And this idea that architecture is a verb. It's not merely about the object. And as long as we treat architecture as the object, we will never actually resolve a lot of the challenges that we see in our built environments along the way. So they describe it as a common sense approach. This comes from Phil Harris of Tropo Architects, who's a good colleague of mine, but who's come to Uganda a couple of times. And the fact that the act of building itself is about purpose. It's about communities. It's about social and cultural fabrics. And if that's what architecture is, the educational process itself should engage with that. And that brings the point that Hermy made earlier, that maybe the rigid approach to architectural curricula that is being imposed from other areas is part of the problem. Maybe it should open itself up to seeing what else is out there. So quickly to finish off, I have skipped out a couple of slides because they were related to what Hermy has already presented. But this idea of a nurturing approach is really key to some of the things that we're looking at. The fact that we're training future architects to compete in a very different field. We should not be training future architects to compete against each other, which is a bit pointless, really. It's about improving the built environment. And if you're going to improve the built environment, one of the key aspects of that is collaboration. One of the key aspects of that is understanding the world, understanding how we belong to it. And that is something that we need to start building into our courses and into our curriculum. So we're really talking about transformation, this idea of going beyond the status quo, enabling students to increase their engagement with that, understanding that we as educators are not providers of knowledge, because knowledge actually is free, and all you have to do is go online and you see that it's free. Our job really is to enable people to access the information in a meaningful way, which for all of us, students, educators, architects, means challenging our long-held beliefs, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of what is and what should be. And I will finish off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. So we will just keep going. Make it with our time for the day. I think, Garrett, if you're still with us, you could turn on your camera. All right. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Another short introduction from me, and then I'll hand over to you. So Garret Gantner is an architect, urbanist, and educator originally from the US, but with wide experience across East and Southern Africa. He's the director of an architecture program at WITS in Johannesburg, South Africa, where his research focuses on the social impacts of design and strategic methods of using architecture and design as development tools. He is the founder and co-director of Bantu Design and Research, a collaborative architecture, urban design, and urban planning firm that seeks to use design and development strategy to trigger positive social, economic, and environmental impact. He has managed architectural, urban design, and strategic development projects in various Southern and East African countries, and has also collaborated on the shaping of architectural curricula for universities in Rwanda, Tanzania, and South Africa. Thank you for joining us today. We'll hand over to me.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. I'm hoping to get through this without any issues with my connection. As Hermy was speaking, the electricity went out where I'm at, but Mark's talk was so illuminating that he brought the lights back on. As Randy said, I'm based in Johannesburg, but I am currently joining you from Kigali, your neighbor to the south. And I was working on this presentation last night, trying to think about what the title of it should be. And I didn't really come up with a title, so the title of the presentation is just a question mark. But before you think that that's just a cop-out, that I didn't put the effort in, you'll see how that's actually pertinent to the conversation here. I want to start with a little bit of background that comes from the experience I've had in developing architectural education across multiple places. So where are we as a profession? You know, what is it that we do? What is our role? And I think Mark touched on this as well, that we aren't educating architects for the way that architecture was typically practiced. And in some of the research that has gone into the formulation of various curricula that I've worked on, I have a little bit of data. And this is obviously a little bit outdated. You see the date there on the screen, but what you're seeing here is just a little graph of the number of architects per capita in East African countries, and then I've added South Africa there as well, and then a few other countries in the region, and some big international benchmarks. So you can see Italy has more architects than any other country in the world. 1 out of every 516 people is an architect. Most of them are probably working as baristas and Uber drivers, but they have an enormous output of architecturally educated people. On the other hand, from 2016, this situation may have changed, but I suspect it probably hasn't very much, because this is per capita, not total number of architects. So as population grows, the number of architects may grow, but the two cancel each other out. Of all the countries on this list here, Uganda is way at the bottom. And it's not because there isn't an output of educated people who have come through an architectural degree. It's more that there aren't a lot of them registering as professional architects. And at that point in time, this is back when I had just left Rwanda, where I worked for 4 years. Rwanda was only slightly ahead, despite the fact that there hadn't been a school of architecture in the country until 2009, and first graduates weren't until 2014. So there's something very different happening in these different places, where you have a place like Uganda, in which there have been schools of architecture for quite some time, especially Nshemereirwe has been around for a long time. Yet they're not registering as professional architects. and they're not necessarily practicing in the way that a typical architect does. You have these disappearing crop of architects. Compare that with South Africa, where you have a very high number of registered architects and an industry that is really struggling to support them. There's really a limit to the demand for architecture in the country. So, sorry, I'm having trouble changing my slide here. Let me just start that again. So I'm going to take you on a little journey of 3 case studies of curricula that I've worked on. And it even does not include where I currently teach. So these are things I can reflect on somewhat externally. The first in Rwanda, which at the time was called the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology, is now University of Rwanda, where I helped shape the curriculum as the school was first being started. And we had the benefit of a somewhat blank slate to work with. The second was a consultation for the Aga Khan University, which was trying to set up a school in Arusha as part of a larger campus of theirs. And the target here was, although it would be located in Tanzania, the target was really
Garrett, sorry, if you don't mind going back like a minute or so, we had bad internet connection and have lost the last minute of what you said.
Okay. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, you were speaking about South Africa at the time when it went off.
Okay, so what I was saying about South Africa was that there's this relatively high proportion, even in a global context, of architects per capita, but an industry that is really struggling to support them, and a lot of architects in the industry looking for the kind of work that we think of when we think of an architect in a typical sense and not finding it. So my talk is really a case study presentation. I'm going to take you on a little journey of 3 different places where I've worked on the development of curricula. The first in Rwanda, which at the time was called the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology. It's now the University of Rwanda. I was there when the school was first being started and helped to shape what that curriculum became. So it's a school where we're able to start with something of a blank slate. The second is a consultation I did with the Aga Khan University, which was setting up a school in Arusha. And although it would be located in Tanzania, its target was really all of East Africa. And then a third in South Africa for an institution I'm not going to name because this process is still ongoing, and I don't want to reveal too much information about it. But I've chosen these 3 because when you put them together, you get a big picture of what's happening in the region, and you get quite a diversity of ideas and issues to deal with. So this is looking at, how influential are these professions in the design industry. On the vertical axis here is a rough picture of how many professionals there are per capita. I should mention the scale on this drawing is not linear. And then the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is much more of a qualitative analysis of how much influence those professionals have within the industry. And this is based on a number of interviews and surveys that I've done over the years. And what you can see is that there's not really any correlation between the size of the profession and the influence on the industry. So it's not a matter of churning out more architects, because that's clearly not solving the problem. It's more a matter of focusing the attention on how the architects that we do produce can help to shape the industry that we work within. And I would like to add to that, not just architecture, but human settlements as well. And I'm deliberately using the term human settlements and not urban planning, because I do think the 2 are very different. I see human settlements as an intersection between some planning skills, some urban design skills, probably some architecture skills, and perhaps most importantly, some negotiation skills to be able to deal with the kinds of urban conditions that we have in all of these countries. Now, you'll see on the bottom there I have Rwanda blanked out because at the time that I was gathering most of this data, there was no professional registration system and no education system for an urban planning or any kind of related degree. Now there is, and I suspect if I could update this influence on the design industry, the Rwandan context would move way, way out because the speed of change and the pace of development is so extraordinary, and the amount of effort that's going into that discipline is really changing the shape of at least of the city of Kigali, if not the face of the entire country. So once again, we have something that starts out looking like somewhat of a linear relationship, that the more professionals there are, the more influence they have, but there are outliers. So this brings me to why the question mark was an appropriate title, because each of these contexts is different. And they have different backgrounds, they have different educational systems. And the question that I think we always need to ask ourselves, which happens with surprising infrequency in academic institutions, is what is actually the question we are trying to respond to? Or another way of putting that is, where is the demand for the people we are educating? And when I say demand, I don't mean what does the industry want? Because the answer to that would largely be someone who can use Revit or ArchiCAD or AutoCAD or whatever program the office uses to pump out work. So there's a danger in reading the word demand as an immediate demand. Demand is really what we want the demand for our profession to be, and how we believe it has influence and how we believe it can make positive change. And I think to some extent here, you need to distinguish between conceptual demand and actual demand. Conceptual demand is the perception that demand is there, but it has relatively low impact, or it's actually not there at all. Actual demand are the real needs of our society in the built environment. And these two things very frequently do not align with each other. The conceptual demand is usually whatever's hot at the moment, or it's whatever skill is in immediate demand. Sometimes it's policy driven, so it looks like there's a big investment in one part of our sector or another. But unless that actually materializes, it remains something on paper. It's the actual demand that we need to really, really interrogate. So I'm going to walk you through these three processes of how we started to develop a curricula in different places using different contexts. And I, of course, say we because I didn't do any of this alone. Starting in Rwanda, this is about 15 years ago now. But if you try to find what it is that we are reacting to or preparing for, there's a large-scale international investment. That's still true today. There's rapid change and turnover of building stock. That's even more true today. And there were public sector officials who at that time were often very underqualified for the positions they were in, simply because the number of professionals was so low, and the number of professionals from other moderately related disciplines like civil engineering was fairly high. So you would end up with someone with a civil engineering background making architectural and urban planning decisions. And if you're lucky, that person is very competent and they can do a good job, but they're not really trained or educated to think through the issues that a design-based education deals with. This is an image of the Kigali Master Plan, which might look fairly benign, but if you look closely at the buildings kind of on the lower part of the hill, you'll notice that they are all about 5 or 6 stories. And there's some skyscrapers, of course, at the top, but that part down at the bottom where it shows these 5 or 6 story apartment blocks is currently occupied by highly dense informal settlements, or in some cases, leafy suburban homes. So you're looking at a policy-driven environment in which there's basically a blank slate being conceived of that will just get built up new entirely. Now, we can debate whether that's a good idea, but that's not really the purpose of the talk. That's to set the context of where they are. And then they produce renderings like this, which could be anywhere in the world that can grow palm trees in. And so this was the kind of environment that we were facing in setting up this school, where you have the city, most of the city looking like the image on the left, and the aspiration being the image on the right, which I find quite unfortunate as an aspiration because it's a building that has absolutely no relationship to its place. It's very badly designed from a climate standpoint, even though it's one of the easiest climates in the world to design for. The materials are most likely almost entirely from China. There's nothing particularly local about the building on the right. The buildings on the left are obviously just houses for survival. So one could argue that vernacular architecture is always about buildings for survival, but it's not really rooted in a vernacular tradition either. So you have a context in which you are in an environment where almost none of what you're looking at is actually coming from that place in any real sense. So the question that we had to start grappling with was then fairly obvious. What is a uniquely Rwandan architecture? There had never been a school of architecture in Rwanda before. What was existing in settlements was debatably Rwandan. What was being built was less debatably, I think, certainly not coming from any kind of architectural tradition. And as Mark mentioned, there's no documentation of what the architectural tradition is. This was, I'm putting a date on this now, this was happening shortly after Rem Koolhaas started publishing about Lagos, which is the image on the left, in which Rem Koolhaas and his team from Harvard, very well-financed team from Harvard, decided that they were going to study the city by renting a helicopter and flying over the top and just observing how dynamic it is and in awe of the way that the city works. But that's actually really a superficial way of looking at the environments we deal with. And aside from the fact that a school in Rwanda doesn't have the resources to rent a helicopter, it's also just not really gaining an understanding. So on the right are the students that we were working with in an informal settlements upgrading project that was part of the academic experience for them. Trying to get them out of the classroom into the communities and actually understanding that not everything is going to be bling architecture, but actually the roles that you might play in the profession come in many different shapes and forms. And the ability to commandeer that process and to negotiate and to participate with people who are actually affected by the work being done in the built environment became a critical part of the education. The other part of this question of what is a uniquely Rwandan architecture started to focus on materials. This is a place that at that time, I think it's probably still true today, there's very little production of building materials in the country other than cement. So the images you're seeing here are just some examples of some real buildings, some kind of experimental exhibit type pavilions that start to investigate how one can take a material palette that exists in the country and really kind of develop it into a new form of vernacular that might be able to bring some identity to this architecture. Now let's move to East Africa, where there were a much different series of questions to grapple with. So I'm going to quickly go through a little bit of background here about what we were trying to react to or prepare for. Kenya, for example, at this point in time, the governmental structure of Kenya had just gone through a devolution process where a lot of the power was moved from a centralized authority to the counties, of which there are 47 in Kenya. And every single one of them was supposed to develop their own municipal land use plans, their own regulations, their own spatial development frameworks. But the demand for architects, because those tasks are largely in the urban planning discipline, the demand for architects themselves was quite difficult to discern. Tanzania, it's quite similar to Uganda. There are a lot of unlicensed architects which are really driving the market. And there is some opening up of public sector attention to human settlements and planning needs. Uganda had, at that time, at least according to their own research, the need for 740 urban planners in the country in order to deal with the urban development. But that same document made no mention of architects at all. And this is a major national policy that sees how they're planning to spend resources, and they didn't think that an architect was relevant, not even one. On the other hand, there's an expanding construction industry. So we started to identify what the needs are. Right? Most of the things I showed you in those contextual slides were related not necessarily to large-scale development, in which there is a small coterie of architects that are doing relatively good work, but most of the needs are actually in the public engagement of how we deal with the problems of the built environment. Their campus was meant to be in Arusha. I don't believe they've built anything even at this time, but that was the plan, which is potentially a somewhat isolating location, because although Arusha is not small, it's also away from the centers of activity elsewhere in East Africa. So the question then became, how do we create an education that is based on networking of engagement through partners and field offices, rather than one that is centralized in an institution? And how does that become an opportunity for advocacy in the built environment sphere? And you're dealing with settlements in these countries that often look a lot like this or like this, and some of them are literally at the door of the campus that was being proposed. So rather than trying to educate an architect to deal with, as Mark was mentioning, the individual objects, the goal here was really to counteract the forces that were around them and steer them in a more positive direction. So rather than being a kind of negative response to a situation like this, in which people would say that this is not a desirable goal, or is something that you don't want in your backyard, we approached it with a sort of YIMBY, which is a play on NIMBY. Instead of not in my backyard, yes, in my backyard is where the education would take place. And the question then becomes, how do we get the information that is needed in order to develop that? There's an enormous research need in order to understand what the needs are, both at an urban scale and at the scale of buildings themselves that populate that urban scale. And there was a question about how broadly one can be exposed throughout the region in order to propel more self-directed research to start filling this gap. The question here was really, how do we eliminate the boundaries between disciplines? Because this is a talk about architecture, but most of what I've said in the last 3 or 4 minutes is about human settlements and urban planning. And the answers started to come through things like breaking down the barriers of design studios, breaking down the barriers of scale, understanding things from a settlement perspective and from a construction perspective, even if that construction perspective is very low tech and not particularly magnanimous. It's not something that might make your way into an architectural magazine. And there became a real focus on interdisciplinarity, which led to this little diagram about how the design studios need to always be at the intersection of multiple different disciplines. That there's never a case that something exists in its own house in isolation, but the studios are actively constructed around tackling more than one issue at a time. Also through this research, what we started to find was that, going back to this conversation of conceptual demand versus actual demand, that urban design from an actual demand standpoint is probably the single most sought after skill in the region, but the conceptual demand for it is extremely low. Nobody really understands what urban design is. Nobody ever thinks of putting an urban designer as part of a public tender that requires a team of expertise in order to build something in the public sector. Nobody who's building a building thinks of employing an urban designer. Yet this need, because of the development practices going on, is extraordinary. And so a sub-question, which I don't think we have an answer for yet, is how do we reveal the actual demand and kind of put to rest the conceptual demands of the industry. And that led to some idea of vertically integrated courses through this interdisciplinary education. Now I'm going to take you down south, where I normally am. And the situation here is really quite different. You have a stronger base of private clientele for architects, but a pretty weak economic outlook long term. At the same time, you have this rather high range of technological sophistication if you can access it, but you have high unemployment rates in the architectural sector. There are already 9 accredited schools, so just saying how do we create a good school of architecture is not really going to get you anywhere. It needs to be something that is relatively unique. The institution I'm working with on this is based in the Johannesburg region, but not directly in Johannesburg. And I'm showing this image just as a contextual reference that what you see in the foreground are townships that are deeply impoverished, and what you see in the background is the most expensive real estate on the African continent, and they exist right in proximity to each other. So you have this very unique situation in which you have just about every possible context you can imagine anywhere in the world put together all in one place. And what that means is that you also have high levels of industrial capabilities. This is a robotics lab in Johannesburg that is experimenting with fabrication. So you have this very unique environment where you have a lot of community-based needs, but you have access to this highly sophisticated technology and a private sector that, if the financing is there, becomes very active and is actually quite robust. At the same time, you have this conversation about decolonizing an architectural curriculum, which is an entirely different conversation. But in the context that I'm putting it here, it becomes a question of, what are we actually trying to produce people to do? If we want them to affect situations like this place in the foreground, and we want them to have mastered the ability to control the technology that is likely to be a part of our future, then how do we make sure that we are the ones controlling the technology and it's not the technology controlling our design process, which is something that I see increasingly in students in South Africa, where a design decision only gets made if they're confident they can draw it in Revit. What happens when Revit becomes outdated and the tools are much more sophisticated? So those lead to the question that we ultimately settled on, which was, what would a 21st century digital TVET school for architects be? The emphasis here is on hard skills, not really architectural theory, but not hard skills in a traditional TVET sense, not hard skills like electricians and plumbers, but hard skills as in the production of architectural or designed products that can be taken to market. And this is from the working board where we're starting to understand how we do that. We started to break down the skills rather than the subject matter. So the letter codes there are all a particular type of skill that needs some emphasis. And the image you're seeing on the right is actually an AI generated image. And I didn't produce this, my colleague Sachaba Mape produced this. But what we started looking at was just trying to prompt an AI image generator with the kinds of things we were thinking about and seeing what came back. So this is one of the things that comes back. And it's probably a fantasy, but you see a high-rise building made out of some kind of natural material on a site. In the background, you start to see objects which might be study models. They might be lampshades. We don't really know what they are. They're this intersection between an experimental design process that starts with a digital process and then goes back into a fabrication process as part of the testing of the design. This was also from our working board, where we started to develop what the courses might be, and the colors here correspond to the colors on the letters of the skills. We started calling these flowers rather than courses because they were meant to have multiple things happening and they cross-pollinate each other. But immediately you can start to see the thinking of how the curriculum develops. This, for example, was meant to be semester 1. You can see that the first design studio is not called Architectural Design 1, it's called Sandbox, which emphasizes the fact that it's something that you make something and then it falls apart, and then you make something else and then it falls apart. And similarly, a theoretical part of the education in terms of history and theories is it's not architectural history and theory, it's called worldview. Because the idea is that if we are able to orient the thinking back to a much deeper understanding of where we come from, a kind of systems thinking approach that deals with indigenous knowledges that might be ancient in their wisdom, and then marry that with the kinds of sophisticated technology we're talking about, then there's space for exploration in places that not many people, at least not that I'm aware of, have explored before. So these are a few other AI generated images, and you see there's not even really any architecture here. There's a woman on the left who's made a drone out of natural materials. There's an object on the right, which maybe it's a structural model, maybe it's a lampshade. It doesn't really matter what the product is in these images. It's just to give a sense of the kind of process that we're trying to create, in which you use AI and potentially highly sophisticated technology to rapidly produce conceptual options, but always grounding it in that worldview that it needs to come from a place that is rooted in the location, and that gets us out of the kind of problems we've designed ourselves into by linking them back to the land, to the place, to systems that work, and produce someone who has hard skills to be able to produce these kind of prototypes, whether that at an architectural scale or at an object scale or a functional scale like this drone, which doesn't really exist, by the way. The skills are there no matter what the scale. And then being able to take that to market so that one can find space in a profession that in South Africa is actually probably shrinking rather than growing. That being the sector of architecture that deals with normal design and construction of buildings. So the curriculum here, this is the color code is the skill sets again, and you can see there are courses, but the courses are really just houses for how these things mix and match with each other and how they support each other across entire semesters and how they scaffold vertically. The skill sets jump from one course stream to another. They don't necessarily stay neatly within their boundaries. So all of these are based on questions, and this is why I'm still going to argue that a question mark is the appropriate title for this talk, because the starting point for all of these was finding the right question, and the endpoints were very, very different based on the formulation of that question, and I think that will always be the case. We as educators need to consistently re-ask the question. Now, you can't reshape an architectural curriculum every single year, but you can tweak it, and you can have periods of major overhaul that start to respond to the right question. So the really tricky thing here is not understanding what is it that we're trying to produce, it's understanding what is it that we're trying to ask. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Randy.
Thank you, Garrett, for your presentation. And yeah, I think we've now had 3 very interesting presentations with kind of lots of different ideas, and reminding everyone we're actually trying to find out like what is an appropriate architecture for East Africa. That's what we're looking at today. So I'm just going to ask if the 3 speakers would put their videos on and we see kind of how that looks as we move into a discussion session. Then I will invite our panelists up onto the front stage. You're welcome to take a seat where you would like. And the people who are joining us online, you can start to, I mean, if you have questions and queries, you can put them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll try our best to get to you within this period. You can also ask your questions later. Same as everyone in the audience, once we've heard from our panelists, the floor is open to you. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to our panelists, I think, just so that everyone knows who we have brought here today. I think we try to, we looked for panelists that had different experiences and represent different parts of the topic that we're discussing today, and we hope we will see that from from what they are able to share with us. So we have architect Davy Mugamba, who is sitting here on the far left, closest to me. He's a seasoned architect with a remarkable 40 years of invaluable experience in this field of architecture and project management. He has been registered with USA for a long time and has had the highest membership status of being a fellow member. He has consistently demonstrated a commitment to development of the architectural profession in the region and has been a trustee representing USA on the East African Institute of Architects Board since 2013. He is at the helm of ProPlan Planners, which he founded in 1991, and his practice has been mostly focusing on design and execution of commercial, industrial, hospitality, and residential projects, varying in various kind of scales and complexity in Kampala and across Uganda. And he has experiences from other places as well. So I think that's a first. I think I'll introduce all of you, if that's okay. Then we have Dr. Connie Nshemereirwe, and she is an engineer turned educator. She spent 50 years as an academic at Uganda Martyrs University. She left 15. Oh, sorry. 15. Excuse me. And she left academia in 2016, and now acts as the policy and science interface as a speaker, trainer, and science communicator. She's currently the director of Africa Science Leadership Program at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And she runs a podcast which is called A's for Apple that explores issues of educational equality and relevance across the continent. And then lastly, we have Mr. Stephen Muwanguzi. He is a current student at Uganda Martyrs University in his third year. He has previous experience interning at Adjunct Architecture for a few months. He also has a broad base of interest in innovative and sustainable design and architecture. And last year, he was a key member of the team that was called Mountain Gorillas, and they won first prize in the Community Health Center category for an international design competition, EUI. So those are our three panelists. I think the idea is behind this is that we would invite them to comment and share their, I think, responses to the different presentations that we've just had, but also pose questions to any of the speakers that they might want to address. So I think maybe we could do it in the order that we have just spoken, but you're also welcome to interrupt. You will all need the microphone to be heard. Just
I can speak from here.
Yeah.
Thank you, and Localworks for the invitation. I think Gantner, last speaker. Garret, put it correctly about how challenging it is to deal with this topic. I need to make a quick disclaimer. I've been operating all around as an architect. I'm actually still a student. The more time I spend with the practice, the more I learn changing conditions and circumstances. But firstly, I I appreciate the three speakers. I had the benefit of interacting with Olweny as an external examiner at Muwanguzi, where he was head. And I'm pleased with Hermie's experience, especially that touches on looking at the practical side and formal side of architecture or practice. And obviously, I'm actually quite excited with Gantner's experience looking through urban design and the multiplicity of disciplines to really make an effect on the built environment. So the built environment per se. I've had the opportunity, I must call it, of having some exposure to Asia, where I trained for 5 years. And this is many years ago at the Uganda Institute of Technology. I've not trained as an architect in Uganda. That's why I think I'm still studying the architecture in Uganda. Although I've practiced here most of my life. But the experience I got from India, Indian Institute of Technology, was actually broad and technical, less theoretical. That's what I can say from the interaction I've had here. It was quite technical and broad in scope and deeper. And I've had also exposure to urban spatial planning, from Germany. And this is where it really becomes interesting, because I think there is a big disconnect here between the practice as we practice as architects and how we connect it to our built environment in terms of the wider scale where really architect would be operating beyond just the simple plots of properties here that we work on. So that for me is a big challenge, and I think until we address that one, it will be very difficult to really break through as architects in this built environment. I found Mark's presentation very challenging because especially looking towards vernacular architecture and the history of architecture, like I told you, the history of architecture was actually not based on the Western models. The Indians had changed that. It was based on the Indian history of architecture, Asia, and the rest of the world. It was more focused on India, actually. And we traveled a lot, traversed the entire subcontinent, looking at different forms, because it's a subcontinent. And it was quite exciting, very inspiring, because you have all sorts of sites and climatic conditions and people and so on, cultures. A good mix, I must say. In Germany, it was very interesting because the spatial plan is very clear. It must start from there. Everything now comes in. It was not even demarcated. Physical planning in the other sense here, where you have regional planners doing urban design, which is three-dimensional. It was very clear with the ecology and other aspects of planning were clear, very clearly demarcated. So here we miss, in Uganda, as he correctly said, several stages, several steps in the planning horizon. So I then went to Uganda, to University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, which was now focusing more on housing for me and human settlement. I came back to Uganda very excited to be an urban designer, urban planner. And I got a job, managing these cities with plans, good plans to execute. But now my first question would really go to Gantner from my experience. The issue of policy and politics in really making a breakthrough. It became a question of policy and politics for that to happen. I'm an architect, but I only practiced planning, which I did at Masters, for 1 year, that 1 year, and converted to architecture because things were flowing, things were happening. So that challenge, when you compare, because I've seen that very interesting graphic about how quickly it can, surpass the others. in terms of the penetration planning, actually the influence. And it's very interesting because now how does that relate with the aspect of policy and the political, structure around it? Then it's interesting for Hermy because there I find most of our star architects or the historical ones that you know about really did go through formal education. So it's very clear. I mean, that statement about informality, accessibility is quite correct. And I'm very pleased with what Localworks is doing here. But in Uganda here, we find a challenge because I've had several students coming through my practice or office. Their biggest challenge is when they want to upgrade from diploma or technical training at Jambo to get a degree at Makerere. There are roadblocks, serious roadblocks, because there's no provision to give them some credit for something they already know. It goes back to theoretical. That's why I stated at the onset that there's so much theoretical tendency here that until that one is broken in terms of curriculum, which interestingly should be reviewed and revised regularly, it doesn't seem to change in our situation here. So that's why a lot of architects are actually missing in the up-country setting where 70% of the population lives. Even the so-called new cities that have been created, for the information of our non-Ugandan colleagues here, there are cities that have been created. I've been really very hard trying to figure out how much of the urban or the planning has gone into it. There's practically zero. Many of them don't even have updated plans. So we really have to go back more or less practically to planning before the architecture and urban design and other scales can count. Now, vernacular architecture, Mark, my challenge is we've tried through experience to work with straw, to work with thatch, to work with bricks, to work with stuff. But now thatch is a challenge. You practically cannot find it except in gazetted areas. In the West, I know for sure. I grew up, like you said, I'm above 60. I grew up in an urban, semi-urban, and rural setting. And there was thatch. There's no thatch. And there's even the bricks and so on, the concept has changed from, adobe to burnt bricks and deforestation and all that depletion of our environment. So how do we benchmark if we are doing education? Another question, I think the question maybe, I'm trying to figure out a question for Mark. Mark, you're on the board of education on the East African Institute of Architects. I've lately found, without details, because I've not been on that board, that Jomo Kenyatta University or something, National Technical University, is winning the awards. So is there something they are doing that the rest of the universities here can benchmark, or is there something they're doing? I mean, forget about that history from the contemporary architects of international repute. Locally, what are they doing that you can use to benchmark? Hermy, I don't have a clear question for you at this point, but I appreciate the orientation towards, I think, interior and sustainable living, which for me crosses the boundaries, is multidisciplinary. I just want to say that here we still don't have very clear-cut demarcations, nationally, licensing or recognizing architects, interior designers, and landscape architects per se. They still operate, of course, informally and through, collabos with architects and the rest. Yeah, so I think for starters, I'll start from there. My 5 minutes must be over. Thank you.
I think it would be good, actually. There are quite a few questions. Maybe we run through them and then we'll move on to Connie. So I think, the questions were sort of directed to Garrett and Mark. I don't know if I've just written some points. So Garrett, it was more the issue of policy and politics and how you actually make things come to life. And then Mark, I think you might have gotten that a little bit better than me, but the availability of materials and how we address that challenge. I think if that's clear. And then Hermy, there was no, but also maybe you asked about the progression of students. How does it practically work out in reality? So I think with the informal if you're trying to include more of an informal selection of students, how does that kind of work practically with the formal students and the challenges of bridging the two?
Maybe I might structure it. I'll try to structure it. For students who have not been through the formal university education route and want to join and upgrade to university or graduate status, how does it work in South Africa?
Sorry, I think I missed that part of the question. I just heard that it was directed to South Africa, so I'm not sure if it was for Hermy or for me.
I think
Yeah, anyone.
I got that one. I think that was the last one was for me. So I don't know who wants to start.
I don't mind starting. I think I mean the question of urbanism and where design comes in and how it interfaces with politics is always a tricky one. In my slides, I had that image of students in Kigali working on an informal settlements upgrading project as an academic exercise. I don't think I would do that in South Africa, at least not in that way, because the politics are much more charged. And if you run a semester-long studio with people looking around and doing research on the ground, there's always the likelihood that you cause more anger than anything else. So it has to be selective to the place. But I think more generally, to me, one of the great tragedies of the 20th century is that we all normalize this idea that urbanism is something that operates purely in the political sphere, and that it's not something that's in the spatial sphere, because it's really both. And the fact that what we consider to be relatively normal in the discipline we've now come to know as urban planning is that it's really just that, it's planning. It's not design, right? And I think that's a huge problem. And that problem shows, it's manifested everywhere. And South African cities are buried up to their necks in policy. And if you look at it on paper, a lot of the policy is actually really good, but it's not achieving the results that they wanted to achieve for a number of reasons. One of which is that if there's nobody who understands how something can be translated from a high-level document or planning procedure that thinks about how the development of a city interfaces with economies and ecologies and integration and democracy and all of these things. If there's nobody who can take that down to the scale of a brick or a light pole or a bench or a front door to a building or a bus stop or an interface with the things that people actually experience when they're out in public spaces, then those policy-based documents will just remain on paper, and they'll just be measured by statistics rather than being measured by quality of life. So I think the onus is to some extent on us as a profession to advocate for our relevance. It's not that people aren't doing that. I'm fully aware that that's been a part of the architectural story for quite some time. But I do believe that it's reaching a point where you have policies that have been tried and tried and tried and tried, and they're not really bringing solutions. And it's not because the policy is incorrect. It's because the ability to implement a policy requires a form of design thinking. So when I talk about an urban designer could be an architect. In fact, most likely is an architect. But it's someone who feels comfortable in both those realms, who understands the rationale and how policy decision gets made, but who also can think through the problem the way that a designer thinks through the problem. And that those two skills in the same person are fairly rare, because we tend to gravitate towards specializations. Which is also the result of industrial education in an industrialized society. The more hyper-specialized you are, the more expertise you have. But we remain in a discipline where some broad general knowledge is still very valuable. So I think there's certainly a lot of variance for how that plays out in different locations. But I do think it's very much needed, and it's, as I was saying, it's an actual demand, but we have to find ways to get it to also be a conceptual demand, because at the moment the perception is that it's a nice to have, but not an essential skill.
I'm happy to jump in with the question on which dealt with the progression of students if they do have informal education, and that was more of something that I am advocating for as an alternative means of education, not necessarily something that is existing. Currently, because we have different registration categories for professionals, there is a kind of recognition of prior learning process to register as a professional, even if you don't have the qualification. But the experience maybe in an office, although it's quite a difficult process, and not a lot of people are successful with it. But my thinking is coming more from the possibility of having alternatives to formal education. And I don't have a clear idea about what that could be, but I'm thinking of a person that starts to work in hands-on making, learning natural building skills, having developed their work, and I'm talking about a specific person that I have in mind here, and then being able to develop buildings, work with architects in this space, but essentially having a hands-on education from both the design and technology side, but not a formal education. And it might be that there are these type of alternative paths into which we can have young people that go, because often this work, the specific work I'm talking about, does happen in communities. It is visible work. It is work that school children around access and can maybe visually see and get interested in, but they might not have the opportunity to go to university. So if we can find these alternative paths that could also lead to a education in the profession or recognition of that kind of learning, but there isn't anything in place like that at the moment. It's merely an idea that there could be a possibility of something that happens from the ground up instead of having to go through formal education. Yeah, so it's not a clear idea at this point. It links to ideas of alternative practice, and that's maybe another point, and which I'm bringing in. But I find that often in our space, in master students would do work in communities, work with participatory design, and develop project ideas in communities. But when you get into the world of practice, there isn't a lot of that happening. There aren't architects involved, so it stops. It stops at the end of the education, and that space isn't occupied by professionals. So it's those spaces that that might be sitting in formal educational spaces, but that doesn't really translate to the world of practice. And how can we find those spaces and populate them, and provide alternative types of education towards an architectural career in those spaces. I hope that makes sense in some way.
Okay, thanks, Hermy. I will tackle the third one. Just to clarify that, I probably left out a little bit of information when I presented the Renzo Piano building in Nshemereirwe. I am not advocating for return to the past. I certainly would never do that. What I meant by us appreciating vernacular architecture is to appreciate the why of vernacular architecture. As long as we reduce it to form and materials, we will continue replicating a problem that we don't even understand. And that was my point. Secular buildings were a technical solution to a very specific problem. The use of those materials at a particular point in time were a response to availability. So the question then is, if that is what was then, why are we insisting, and this is prevalent, you will not believe how prevalent it is, that what defines African architecture is something that was defined almost 300 years ago, probably even longer, but that's what defines it. So it's negating everything that has happened in the last 300 years. So the question I keep asking is, if that is the sum total of what is working, why exactly are we doing architecture? Because the answers already exist. But if they don't exist, that becomes a basis to understand why those worked for a society so that we can make decisions going forward. Circular buildings, as we know, don't work with a lot of the materials that we use today. They just don't work. So why would we promote that as a basis? It was an interesting discussion I was having, and you see this, pretty much every building described as a cultural center is a circular building. And you ask why? The only answer that's given, oh, it's African. It has nothing to do with the function, how it works, what is buildings being used of, what is being constructed of, anything. It's just, it is supposedly African. But if you go and look, pretty much every building north of, well, in Sudan North, there are no circular buildings. You go to West Africa, there are no circular buildings. So what is this Africa that we keep talking about? It doesn't exist. So it's a fabrication. But the very fact that us as Africans in Africa describe that as what is African is very problematic. So we are the problem. It is not the solution. We are the problem because we refuse to go beyond a particular set point in time. So what I'm advocating for is for us to learn from what our ancestors did. How did they lay out these spaces? Why is there a particular context that was a particular setting that existed? What is the relationship between spaces? Even if we build these, we know these buildings were built for occupation at night. They're not built for occupation during the day, so you can't build them anyway. So there's so many things that we just fail to appreciate of such projects before we can take them forward. Yeah, so it's learning from the past to enable us to make decisions for the future. That is the most fundamental thing that we study history about. And that is what is missing for us. Because we don't know what we have done or our ancestors did, all we do is take what other people have done and then use it out of context. That's why we get such disjointed built environments, because there is no basis of those anywhere. And that comes back to the urbanism issues that Garret was talking about. It's interesting. I'm increasingly describing myself now as a geographer and urban designer rather than architect, but for this very reason, because it is very frustrating when architecture is literally reduced to the form making. It's literally reduced to a building. And the one thing that defines our built environments now is the wall. Drive down every street in Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and increasingly Uganda. The only interface with the built environment is a wall. When I first came across that in Zimbabwe in 1980, I actually laughed about it. But now that's the norm in Uganda. So how are we contributing to this? As an architect, we're not, because what we do is hidden behind walls anyways. So we're not contributing at all. Okay, then back to the Board of Education. Unfortunately, I have not been part of that organization probably last 6 years. And that's unfortunate because we're not quite sure what some of these education boards do. They seem more interested in gatekeeping than promoting or advancing architecture education. I may be challenged on that, but that's my opinion. Unless we're pushing the envelope of what the profession can do, and all we're doing is gatekeeping, the profession itself can't develop, and it needs to develop. The only way it can do that is by changing the paradigm. It's quite intriguing being in the UK at the time right now. The Architects Registration Board has announced a fundamental change to the way it registers architects here, which will completely change education. So it will no longer be considering undergraduate degrees, which opens the gates to all sorts of different approaches at the undergraduate level. And it will only be registering people basically on the master's year, the last 2 years, which is what, for the most part, the US and Canada have been doing for years. And you can see the diversity that came out of that. It's very, very different. So the rigidity actually causes a lot of our problems because we're presuming that there's only one way to do things. But we know that is not the case because we have a lot of students from different backgrounds. People who are coming to university for the first time in their families. There's a lot going on there. And we have to cater for that through different approaches to get to the end. So I would like to see our professional bodies and the East African Institute take a much more proactive approach rather than a defensive approach to education. As for Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, I do work a lot with them. I still work with them. We were writing a proposal for energy and education just a couple of weeks ago. And they're very proactive. They're very enthusiastic about change. And it probably comes from the way that school itself was founded and its relationship to the other schools in the area. So it being proactive is a direct consequence of that. So they have done very well, and I'm always intrigued to see how they've managed to pull it off. They're also a school that incorporates architecture and landscape architecture. We haven't actually talked about that, which is also an important engagement. And by sitting outside what you can call the standard realm of education, they have had that leeway to do so. Although they are still a public university, they seem to have taken that on board and sort of run with it quite well over the last few years. So yeah, I'll be intrigued to see how they go forward with it, but they certainly do work hard at getting where they are. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to hand over to
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And what a wonderful set of presentations we've had this evening. And I'd just like to pick up on a word that Mark used, which for me, as an educator, is the ideal outcome of an education. And that is that the educated person should be able to respond to the needs of society, should be able to respond to the problem solved, to solve the issues that are around them. But unfortunately, from just also make a correction, the podcast that I run is called A is Not for Apple. And it came up because I used to live in a rural area and I used to see these little boys and girls, very bright. When you ask them about, they knew a lot more about the local fauna than I did, for instance. But as soon as they went to school, there was a big chart on the wall that started with A is for apple. And in the whole village of Kozi, there was not an apple tree or an apple being sold. So these children will learn this foreign language, English, because they didn't speak English either, pointing to a foreign object, this thing, apple. And so they were forced from the beginning to learn a foreign language that is modeled by a foreign object. So there was no way that they could connect this journey of education to their own lives. There was no roasted maize, there was no jackfruit, there was no, the things that they were very knowledgeable about. So as soon as we enter school, we have to put everything that we know aside and never trust what we know, but only begin to identify being educated with knowing all these other things that we are told. And so just to say that the points that Mark was making about decolonizing education, because that's my own field as an educator, not only start in architecture school, the students come into architecture schools already formed to just be out of touch with the natural environment, with the reality of all these other less educated or uneducated people. So for instance, I remember in agriculture class, we did go out and collect samples, but we brought them back into the classroom and were taught the Latin names, whereas there were local names. And so until I was in my mid-20s, I could not really appreciate a pawpaw tree from a cassava plant if they were still quite young. And I was an educated person. And so I just want to make the point that as much as in the educating of architects, it's the same problem in all education, educating all professionals or educating all these people who are educated. It's that from the very beginning, we are unable to respond to an environment or a society that we have been divorced from. We cannot even trust our own experience because it has been negated from the beginning. And I gave an example, for instance, of a woman who sells me jackfruit. Jackfruit is my favorite fruit. And she disappeared for a couple of months and then appeared again with a baby. She said, "Oh, I did not know you were pregnant." I said, "Well, culturally, you do not announce your pregnancy, hide it, and then when you can no longer hide it, you disappear until you give birth because you might get the evil eye." And this is a woman who sells fene in jackfruit, that is fene, in suburb here in Kampala. So when I encounter these realities as an educated person, it really makes me realize that I think it's nearly impossible for me to respond to this reality. I'm so divorced from it. And my training has taught me to really, there's a standard that has been set for me. A building is like this. And again, as Mark was saying, it's reduced to form, and you do not know why people do what they do. So I think what I'd like to challenge us with this evening is to really think deeply about the fact that our education systems from the onset, some of the issues that are in the systems that are at higher level are all through the system. And so what are we going to do about it? It's really a very deep problem that we have to engage with and address. Those would be my contributions. Thank
you so much. Localtalks, Localworks for the Localtalks. Here, I welcome you all. It's a very good discussion we've had. I have a few questions to pose to the speakers.
first question will go to Dr. Hermy. She was talking about a hands-on experience for students, and she talked about visiting professional farms and buildings so that students get to know what's actual or what's in the real world versus what they study in school or in class. And I want to pose a question about the role of what's the role of the architectural professional firms in educating the future architects? Because we've been talking about the students and the schools of architecture. Then we talked about the boards of education and stuff like that. But are we given enough thought about what the roles of the professional firms are in educating the future profession? Because I see a gap where we go through school and the only time you interact with the professional office is when you apply for internship or applying for a placement. There are a few firms that actually come out to the architecture schools and follow up on the students, right from, let me say, first year to the 5th year. A few firms do that. And would it be posing a problem at some point in the process of educating the profession? That's to Dr. Hermy. And looking at the title of the local talk, Nurturing East Africa's Architects, the word nurturing caught my attention. So the question will go to Dr. Mark. The question goes is, what are the qualities of a good nurturer? Because when you are nurturing, there's someone who's been nurtured and the one nurturing. So is it, as the norm is that, you know, licensed architects can be lecturers of architecture. What are the qualities of a good educator of architecture? Should we take it like it is that whoever has been licensed to practice architecture is fit enough to be an educator in architecture schools? Or is there a way, are there qualities that are not yet exposed that we should look for, all schools of architecture should look for in hiring people that are supposed to take on this process of educating and nurturing the future professionals? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to try and answer, and I hope I got the question clear. It was about hands-on experiences, but then also how the professionals play a role or could play a role in education and in formal education. Maybe I can start by saying that for me, and it might be repeating what I already said, but the hands-on experience is also a lived experience. I have an affinity for design build schools where students really get to experience the making of buildings. And there was a lot of talk already tonight about materiality and how that informs the making of buildings, that we can't divorce that it's not only about form, but it's really about what is available locally. And those hands-on experiences for me in terms of materiality, I think is really important. And that's often something that does not happen in a very formal environment due to a number of circumstances. But it goes beyond just the materiality. It's also experience of actual buildings, being able to go to places, visiting urban spaces, visiting through actual experience, being able to immerse yourself in good architecture, good conditions, good urban spaces, being able to do that. So that is also part of the experiential. And then I think there was a time, especially in South Africa, where a lot of people that taught informal education were not solely focused on academics. Their there were a lot of practitioners that taught. They were actually practitioners, but they taught in architecture schools, and that balance has shifted to the extent where, and I'm guessing it's part of the big focus that is placed on the production of research, partly, but that has shifted so that there are not a lot of people that still practice and are part of architecture schools. It's much less than before, and in that sense, I think the world of practice is a bit divorced from the architectural education, the formal architectural education space. And there should be opportunities to bring that closer. The question is often, though, also what kind of practice, because there are different kinds of practices out there. So it depends on what the school, or depends on who you bring into the school, and how that aligns with what the school is trying to do. But certainly there should be some alignment, I think, which would make a lot of sense. I hope that answers your question.
He doesn't have the microphone, I guess. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Just piggybacking on that, I think this idea of practitioners in education, the challenge that Hermie's just raised is not unique to South Africa. It's a clear issue in Uganda as well. And if you go into any school of architecture and see the adverts that go out and see the number of people in practice that actually answer those ads, it's very small. The question then is, why aren't they responding, is one question. The other question that is linked to that is the rules and regulations that were brought in, which have done the one thing that you didn't want them to do. So in Uganda, I think it was probably about 10 years ago, when the regulations for education were being put in force, the clause that said to teach architecture, thou shalt have a PhD. The question I asked is, why would you put a clause in a document knowing very well that you are eliminating 99% of the people? How is that a good clause to put in? So we make regulations that we know are going to cause problems. And then when the problems come, we start blaming somebody else. So I made that comment before that became a regulation, and everyone ignored it. And now if you go to every school of architecture in Uganda, there's a shortage of staff. But we caused the problem because we made a regulation that we knew very well could never be fulfilled. So we really need to check ourselves and see what actually is our end goal and how we're going to get to that end goal to get to the state where we need to be. And so that graph that Garrett showed is only going to get worse because we have a shortage of educators. So that's one way. Then the other side also has to do with, the other question has to do with who makes a good nurturer. Not sure there's a direct answer to this. It comes back to the point which I keep raising. As long as we insist on some form of sameness, we're going to be stuck in the same place. Architecture is a very diverse profession, and we need a lot of different people in there. Now, to get different people, you need people with different qualities. Those different qualities address all the different aspects that come with that, and that also allows the profession to grow, because what the profession is now certainly it shouldn't be what it is in 50 years, what it is today. And if it is, then we have to ask, what have we done wrong? Because if it's the same, we really need to check what is going on in the society, in the profession, in the schools, in the universities, because it has to grow, it has to evolve. And so computing is really a good example. Why is it that today that no school of architecture pretty much in East Africa teaches design computing? Key question that we have to ask. Computing has been the norm in the last 30, 40 years. Why do we still not teach it? What's the problem? So when we look for answers, we say we want an individual to do this, and that's the only person we're going to do. It stifles creativity, it stifles progress. So we need to be looking at what our end goal is and bring in appropriate people to engage with that at a particular point in time. This also links to, again, roundabout way, which I left up before, this idea of practitioners in university settings. Those rules and regulations we've asked for PhDs essentially removes the ability to bring in knowledgeable people who don't even have degrees, and yet they're the very people you need in your schools of architecture because of the cultural factors that they bring with them. And this was something that was raised at a seminar at University of the Witwatersrand. Hermy was at 2017, I believe it was. And that was a key thing. It's how is it that to be able to support a number of the communities, we need certain things in place, but the system itself is making sure that that doesn't happen. And so you're stuck. How does this work? I think one of the key things that we need to be sure of is the fact that nurturing, mentoring is something that any person who is a qualified architect is obliged to do. It's not, should never be optional. It is something that we all must do. In the UK, where I'm at the moment, that is an area where all firms get their CPD points, what they're called in Uganda. So if you're not mentoring somebody or you're not taking somebody on, you're not doing your job. So we allow people to get away with this in Uganda, and yet it's a key part of what we do. How can we say that students not graduating, they don't know the skills, but at the same time, we're not interested in doing it? All right, so it's a double-edged sword. We really need to start engaging with it. It is our role as professionals to do it. It's a key part of the medical profession. It should also be a key part of architecture. Yes, that's it for me. Thanks. I did notice there were 3 questions in the chat, though.
But we are running, we're already quite, with time is not on our side today. I think we need a whole nother session to keep this going. But I think I wanted to open the floor to the people who are here, just in case there are any burning questions. Maybe we could take 1 or 2 and then close for today. If anyone here has a question. Okay, we have 2 in the back. Maybe we will.
Thank you for the talk. My question is addressed to Dr. Mark. Please point me in the direction of resources or articles on the history of African architecture. That is a place, or I don't know, one of the places that I have failed to find some really good resources on information about the history of Africa. Thank you very much.
I can answer that very quickly. Sadly, very, very sadly, there are not many. And that's the point, and maybe it also answers the very last question by Janelle there. What do we do about that? Vernacular Architecture, the encyclopedia is one. Susan Denyer is another. Susan Denyer's book is quite an old one, but it tackled vernacular architecture. And then we got Ellie Nandi's book that was again published 1996, I believe, on African architecture. It tried to cover a lot and probably could have been split out a little bit more to cover things a little bit in depth. Now, beyond that, there's nothing. Let's be frank, there's literally nothing out there. And this is part of the challenge we have, right? So as I mentioned in my talk, if there's nothing, what have we as designers, as architects, as educators done about it? And if the answer is nothing, we're not doing our job. And that's a key part of the problem, right? How, in a way, it's a double-edged sword, because as Hermy has stated, that the university, to be an academic, you need to publish, which is fine. But we actually do need those publications, otherwise we're not really engaging with it. And this is something that over the years I have been working with students to document buildings and get them published is a key one, and helping them understand what is out there. So it can happen in the schools, and the schools can do this. They just have to take the bull by horns and be able to do it, because it hasn't been published. And there is a wonderful article that Garret wrote that actually dealt with that exploration he did in the informal sediments was a key part of that exploration. How can you use a situation of scarcity as an opportunity? And we have this opportunity that's been sitting with us since architecture education started in Uganda in 1989, but we haven't really addressed it in any way. So it's a really ripe opportunity for us to carry this forward and do something about it. I can say it's something I've been thinking of about, and when the proposal is formally written, which hopefully should happen by the end of this year, we can actually move that. Two sides of that. One is the architecture, documenting that, and the other side, which I spoke to Davy about, was also getting the stories of architects who have worked across East Africa, which again we don't know, and because we don't know, and the adage in Africa is when an elder dies, a library goes with it, and we have to take that seriously, because there's a lot of knowledge that is just going to disappear because we haven't taken it seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. Okay. I appreciate it deeply. Thank you so much for this talk. It's one I appreciate deeply, because it's one probably we needed not today, but like yesterday. And one of my question is, before the policies are affected, how can educators actually implement some of these wonderful ideas? For instance, there's been a conversation about how we should propel collaborations in classroom versus competition against each other while creating this architect. And yet, like, when you really see how we assess, it almost drives for competition against each other. So as educators who are experienced, are there certain practical aspects that you are implementing in your classrooms to do this? And how can someone at an individual level contribute to that while the policies are being worked on in the meeting? Thank you so much. Maybe we'll just ask one of you to respond to that question.
I'm happy to say something about that, and simply because when I studied and did some live and designable projects, the outcome of the study was basically that those types of projects are spaces for collaboration. Collaboration happens almost automatically because there's one goal, especially if students work in a community setting. There's a goal outside themselves that they are working towards. So they collaborate not because they don't think about themselves as the individual. They think about the collective outcome and what will happen with the outcome of the project. It's not for their wellness, it's for somebody else's wellness, and they all contribute together to that. The challenge is how to create those types of spaces if you are not doing something like a design build community project, if you're working in a studio. And very often we are constrained with rules and regulations. There are even rules and regulations in places that stipulate how many group work, what percentage of group work may contribute, for instance, to a final mark of a student. So then you can't do those collaborations, but there are creative ways to go about that. I agree, it's a challenge to bring into collaborative projects into a studio and often and into an educational space. Often there's only group work that focuses on research, and students go away and they really just do the individual research and collate the work. There isn't real collaboration. So I'm not giving you a really great answer in the sense of here are some practical things to do. But if it's possible to design a project where there's a collective goal rather than an individual goal, and if you can bring that into a design space, that certainly it is possible to do. It is challenging in a very formal space where marks and assessment are given and are necessary.
I think should we do one more? All right, let's go then. Hi, my question is to Dr. Hermy. She asked in her speech that why are we reverting back to a pre-COVID state of architectural education instead of embracing the lessons got from online education? And while you said that, I was thinking, why would we revert to online education? Because I started art school online. My first 2 years were online. So my first internship during school, after face-to-face started, they're telling me about drafting, scale ruler. And the only thing I learned from online school was software, CAD, BIM, all those things. And I'm thinking, what was positive about online school apart from software? And maybe one thing that online school pushed for was this sustainability trend, because the world is sick. We need to find a way to help it. But aside from sustainability, why would we revert to online education?
Thanks. I think that's a great question. About what was positive about that. I think it will depend on different experiences. But I do think there were positive things. Some positive things were that we could meet with people across the world and have interactions and different voices in presentations of work. And that happened quite a lot. That was quite a positive thing. It also allowed some flexibility in terms of submissions. I think during the time, there were quite innovative ways of submitting in online spaces, Miro boards and those kind of things, where students could access each other's work. So I think if we start looking at, and there's a real lot of research that came out of that time, that look at some of the positives. I'm not advocating that we go back completely to just that emergency remote teaching where it was a necessity, but that we do try and find what is positive. It could lead to in some theoretical courses, for instance, being more flexible, where you don't have to sit and listen to a lecture. You can have there can be a lecture online, which you can then have a discussion about or have a reflection about. So it can lead to some areas of flexibility. But I'm not trying to say that we need to do it exactly as it was. I'm trying to say, let's find the positives that there were and kind of look at what is positive in what we do in the normal space in the what we see as normal, our spaces we are in now? And are there combinations of those that can improve what we're doing and improve the experience?
Thank you for your question. I guess we're in an online space now, so it's really another answer to the question. But thank you, a semi-hybrid space. But thank you to everyone for coming. It's a bit of an abrupt close, but I think we've overshot our time. Thank you for bearing with us. It's new to us, as you've seen. We're usually online, but we're now trying to be to engage. The original intention of Local Talks was that we do meet like this at our office, and then COVID hit, we went online, and now we're trying to bridge the two. So yeah, we'd like to invite you to come back again. I think we usually have, so it's 4 times a year, so every 3rd month, every 3rd day of the week. So the next one will be middle of June somewhere, and we'll share more information. I think there's some questions, many really interesting questions online, and I'm sure more in the audience. So I think we can continue to collect those and share with the speakers. I'm sure they're happy to continue this conversation, and we can see if there's enough interest. I'm sure there is. We can really try and maybe have a second part 2 or something like that. But yeah, I think that's a lot. That's most of it from us. We record this event, so it will be online. You can watch it later, and we post it on our YouTube channel, which you can find. I think it's Localworks is the name of the YouTube channel, and there's a Local Talks playlist under that. I think that's everything. Thank you for joining us, and yeah, we hope to see you again. Thank you to the speakers. Of course, you've been online for a few hours now. We appreciate your time and contribution to this event, and to our panelists as well. Thank you for listening and sharing your insights with us.